Hello, my name's Thad Lathrop. I am the interim lead pastor here at CIV, and I'm so glad that you could join us as we're wrapping up our Daniel from Captured to Courageous message series this morning, where so far, the first 6 weeks of this series, we've just been going one chapter at a time. And today we are going to go through chapters 7 through 12 and just do a summary of what is going on throughout the second half of the book of Daniel. Now, so far, this series has been just such a great, helpful reminder to continue to stay faithful to God in the midst of this intense pressure that comes at us at different points in our life. Now, the book of Daniel, it can be broken out in a couple of different sections. The first section is chapters 1 through 6, and that is Daniel the prophet. These are stories about his life. These are narratives about what happened during his time as he was a captive in the Babylonian kingdom. Now, chapters 7 through 12, this is Daniel's prophecies. This is world history. It's his present day. It's also near future and distant future prophecies that God had given him visions of. Now, we've looked at Daniel the prophet so far in this series, and something that's been interesting as we have looked at Daniel the prophet is that we've seen, the story that is the main story that we think of with Daniel is when he gets thrown into the lion's den. Well, he was in his 80s at that time. And we've seen other intense stories that have been highlighted in these first 6 chapters, like when they are taken captive from Judah, he and his friends as teens, and they make an appeal to the chief eunuch to not eat the food that the king is offering them because it's been sacrificed to false idols, which was against God's law. And God comes through for them. They eat only vegetables, and they prosper. Another thing we see is Daniel interprets a dream, even though the king won't tell him what the dream is. And he says, you're going to be put to death if you can't interpret this dream. Daniel trusts God. He gives him the dream and the interpretation to tell to King Nebuchadnezzar. Then we see Daniel's friends. They get in a spot where they are told to bow down to this false idol or they will be thrown in a fiery furnace. They stay true to God. They stay faithful to him. They get thrown into the fire furnace and they come out like nothing ever happened. So we get these highlights from Daniel's life over these 70, 80 years while he was captive in Babylon. And these are truly amazing stories of God's miraculous work and what has happened. But what's interesting is this is only a handful of stories that Daniel writes about in those 70-ish years of his time in Babylonian captivity. And in between those huge events, there were probably a lot of monotonous days that didn't make it into this book. And I know for me, sometimes those regular days are a real battle. The intense days are a battle too, but usually there's a lot of adrenaline pumping and I'm getting ready and geared up for those big days or those big intense times where there's a lot of hard things going on. But then there's this letdown in those mundane, monotonous days. Like when my wife was in the hospital for a month in 2021, it was incredibly difficult to handle all the responsibilities and all the stress of not knowing if she was going to be okay. But then, once she was home and things looked like they were settling down, it was even more of a struggle at times to just keep one foot going in front of the other after there was this letdown after that intense period of time. Have you ever felt that way before? This is how life goes. There's these intense seasons and then some rather mundane seasons in life. Both can be a battle. And the book of Daniel and our own experience highlights that getting through life may be a fight to the finish. It'll be a fight in these intense seasons and in these mundane seasons. And the second half of Daniel, it gets into these prophecies about world history and his present day and the future, which reveal some of the fight to the finish that we can expect in our day today. Now, something that's helpful to think about regarding the second half of Daniel is to think of it like being at a parade where there's these floats that are coming by in a sequential order. If you arrive late to the parade and you stand in the middle, then it's going to look like this picture, right? You see only the floats that are directly in front of you. Now, if you want to know what already happened, then you'd have to run to the end of the parade and see the floats that had already passed you by. Or if you were curious, what are the future things that are going to come? Then you'd have to run to the front of the parade and you could see all the floats that were going to be coming down as you were standing there in the middle of the parade. But reading Daniel, it is like getting this helicopter view of the parade, seeing the entire parade in one shot. And Daniel, in this section, it's this incredible bird's eye view of human history. And we read about significant world events that have already happened and predictions about things that have not yet happened. And today is going to be a look at this big picture, second half section of the book of Daniel. Now, there's a lot to study in this second half. Again, we are just going big picture here. So if you want to do your own deep dive and study more of the details about the visions and the symbols and the numbers and the dates and the specific prophecies, then you're welcome to do that. But today, we're going to look at a big picture here. And we see that Daniel tells us about 3 battle fronts that we need to keep an eye on. The first and biggest overarching battlefront that we see in the second half of Daniel is this spiritual conflict. Now, those of us who follow Jesus, we experience spiritual opposition. There's an enormous unseen cosmic battle that is going on all around us. And at one point, Daniel was earnestly praying to God, hoping for a response, and in a vision, an angelic figure comes and speaks to him. Take a look at what it says in Daniel 10, 12, and 13. It says, "Then he said to me," this is the angelic figure, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard. And I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. For I was left there with the kings of Persia." Now here we get this peek into this unseen spiritual realm. Daniel was praying. This messenger was sent to give him a response. And it says the messenger was delayed because of a conflict with the prince of Persia. And he was delayed for 21 days. This prince of Persia was probably a powerful demonic being that had control over that region of Persia. Now, these are very powerful spiritual beings at work that we're seeing in what Daniel is talking about here. And if an evil spirit over the region of Persia could cause such a delay to one of God's mighty angels, it's got to be powerful. Again, there is this cosmic battle happening around us that we can't see. Daniel's giving us a peek into it here. There are these forces that work to influence not just cities, but entire kingdoms with the goal of shaping history, ultimately to oppose the works of God. We read about this opposition in another book of the Bible, the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And in this verse that we find in the book of Revelation, there's a dragon that represents Satan, and a woman represents the human race. Take a look at what it says here. It says, "But the earth came to the help of the woman. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus, and he stood on the sand of the sea. This means, right here, if you are a follower of Jesus, Satan has declared war on you. The more we keep God's commands and hold firm, the more angry he is. Do you ever feel like you're in this fight to keep the faith? That's because it is a fight to keep the faith. This spiritual battle is always in the backdrop of what is going on in our lives. But God doesn't leave us on our own in this conflict. He is right there with us to encourage us, to help us to engage in the fight. And we see a picture of the encouragement that God offers us towards the end of Daniel chapter 10, where the angel just explained that Daniel was going to get a vision for the future. And it must have been really difficult for Daniel to see this vision, because it says that it was causing him pain and he lost his strength. And then look what the angel says to him. O man greatly loved, fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. So there's this cosmic battle going on around us, this backdrop, this spiritual conflict. And that can be concerning, but what we see here is Daniel's strength had left him, and we might feel that at times. But he was strengthened by God's angel in this moment. And God wants to speak courage to us through his word, the Bible, as we engage in this battle as well. So we have this spiritual battle that is going on in the background. And the next battlefront that we see, it's easier for us to see. It's this global conflict. Now, in our lifetime, we'll see nations at war with one another. There's wars going on right now. And we look at history and we see there's this constant rise and fall of many kingdoms. Daniel had a vision of this taking place between nations in chapter 2, where he says a statue in King Nebuchadnezzar's dream with 4 different substances, gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And he's getting this vision of this conflict that is going to be going on. And that's how he interprets it to King Nebuchadnezzar in that chapter. But he gets another vision of this global conflict in chapter 7, which, take a look at what it says. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. Now, this lion represents Babylon, the empire that conquered the Jewish people and kidnapped Daniel and his friends into exile. That is what this first beast is. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So this was the kingdoms of Medes and the Persians. It was a coalition, but one was slightly stronger than the other, which is why it says raised on one side here. They defeated Babylon and they took control. So here we're getting a glimpse of these nations rising up. Now, here's the next beast. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. The next world power that we are seeing here in this beast is Greece, led by Alexander the Great. He defeated everyone else. A leopard is not as strong as a bear or a lion, but it is much faster. And the speed of which Alexander the Great defeated the known world was astounding. He was still young when he had finished conquering the known world, and he actually whined about it because there was no more kingdoms for him to conquer. And at his death, he gave control to his 4 generals. That's the 4 heads that we see here. In the next chapter, Daniel chapter 8, Daniel receives a different but similar dream. And Greece and Alexander is portrayed in that dream as a goat. One that moves so fast its feet didn't even touch the ground. Now, nowadays, the goat means greatest of all time, right? That's hey, he's the goat, is the greatest of all time at something. But that's not what it meant in the Bible. But it is interesting that the image for Greece and Alexander is a goat, because Alexander is still known as one of the greatest military commanders of all time. Now, Daniel goes on, and he has this next vision of a beast. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, this beast is Rome. Rome was in a class of its own. And this beast references multiple future kingdoms. And even there's this little horn that it talks about that's going to rise up, leading the nations astray. And this little horn, what that is talking about is the Antichrist. It's leading people to reject Christ and renounce him. You can read more about this from Daniel chapter 7, verses 19 through 26, and then also in Revelation chapter 13 and 19 and 20. But let's look at these earthly kingdoms for a moment here. We're going to watch a video of battles in history. Now, Wikipedia is the source for this video, so don't get stuck if you think some of the details aren't right. But this is just going to be it's going to give some quick, broad perspective on the battles throughout history. There's going to be a tally at the top right that shows the number of battles won by each nation, each kingdom. White dots appear as the battle takes place, and there's a scrolling timeline that's going on. Babylon, you'll see, tops out at 8, and then Persia at 18, and then Macedon, Greece around 50, but Rome just keeps climbing. Take a look at this video. we see that around 500 AD, Rome had almost triple the battle victories of any other nation. The amount of destruction and bloodshed, it must have been just too much to count. And you see, Daniel, he got a vision of that Rome and how it would devour and break in pieces and stomp on their enemies. And this vision of the beast, it must have been just this huge vision of bloodshed that Daniel was experiencing. And look at what he says in verse 28. It says, "Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart." His color changed because he's so alarmed by what he saw. That would have been extremely overwhelming to have these visions going on. The interesting thing now is that the might of the empire of Rome has gone. And that is what has happened throughout history. Nations, they come and they go. And I'd like to show you another video. This is going to be a very fast time lapse that has been sped up to show every kingdom in the history of the world, the rise and the fall, and the changes that are going on this global landscape. And this helps to give us a grasp of the idea of nations rising and falling. Take a look at this video, and as you're watching it, take note around 500 BC of Daniel's time, what that looked like. And then when it hits 0, and then as it goes on and on, just take a look at what has gone on throughout history with these nations rising and falling. The overwhelming sense from that video is that every nation rises and falls. And it's striking to see this history play out over 4,000 years in just this 2-minute sped up video. And it's interesting how special we feel about where we fall on the timeline, right? As we could put a marker on where we came into that picture. And we feel like this is the end all be all, right? But Daniel had a vision of what was coming. And it says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor Shall the kingdom be left to another people? It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Over and over again, we read in Daniel, God's kingdom will never be destroyed. Why is that repeated throughout the book? Well, because history shows us that every other single kingdom eventually gets destroyed. No country, nation, or kingdom will make it to the end except for one nation, one kingdom. God's kingdom will last forever. It will endure through eternity. All of those kingdoms are like chess pieces, and God himself is moving them around to be in line with his plans, which highlights that history is actually his story. We can trust that God is in control. He's sovereignly moving all of history in the direction of his desired plan. His plans will never be thwarted. We never need to fear what's going to happen to us in the very end, because we know how the story ends. Every kingdom you saw in that video, it had a leader. But do you know who picks the leader? Take a look at Daniel 4:17. It says the sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men. God picks the leader. From Egypt, the first recorded kingdom, through now, our country. That's a lot of people for God to put in place from this time to that time. And it's so comforting to know that his story is being worked out all the time. And if we speed up to the end of human history, we get a glimpse of what that looks like in Daniel as well. Take a look at Daniel 7:27. It says, and the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. The saints are those who serve and obey God. And it is those who serve and obey God that are given the ruling rights of the kingdom. Though we don't deserve it, God will give us the privilege and the authority, but we must obey him. We must trust God and keep the faith to the end. Now, here's the third battlefront that we see. There's this inner conflict as well. We're going to battle with sin and fleshly desires. Our hearts tug at us and often pulling us away from God. This is what happened to the people of Israel. They had chosen to sin, reject God's ways, and that resulted in consequences where God allowed Babylon to overtake them. And that's when Daniel and his friends were taken as captives of Babylon. And Daniel addresses this inner conflict in chapter 9. Take a look at what he says. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. And a little later in chapter 9, Daniel goes on to say this, to the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him and have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God by walking in his laws, which he set before us by his servants, the prophets. So the Israelites, they were in a very rough situation. They got themselves into a mess. And Daniel, he is demonstrating a tremendous amount of humility with these statements that he's making. Though he was righteous, he was following God's commands, doing what was right in the Lord's eyes, he was also concerned for the larger group of Israelites. So he confessed sin for the group. That's what's going on here. And Daniel continued to humble himself in verses 18 and 19, where it says, "O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city that is called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not for your own sake, O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name." As you can see in Daniel, all three battlefronts can feel extremely intense. Whether it's spiritual, global, or inner conflict, it can all feel overwhelming. But what I've learned is that in the intense seasons, it may be a sign that we're actually making progress. And God is leading us towards more maturity where we can be able to trust Him with more and more and more. And the maturity that God grows in us, it brings this stability to life. And we see that God's people are full of hope in their fight to the finish. Take a look at Romans 15:4. It says, "For whatever was written in the former days was written for our instruction." Daniel was written for our instruction, so we can be confident in what we see in Daniel. So it's written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. Hope is a favorable and confident expectation. So we find ourselves in the middle of a spiritual conflict. Yes, we do. But we aren't without hope in this conflict. We have this confident expectation that God is more powerful than any spiritual being. And He will send encouragement like we saw in Daniel 10. And He will give us victory in this spiritual conflict as we lean on Him. Go to Him for strength and encouragement and endurance. And yes, there's this global conflict going on as well, but we have this confident expectations that nations will rise and fall, but God's kingdom lasts forever. His kingdom is the one to invest fully into. And yes, we have this inner conflict that's just going to be going on all of our days, where we need God's help to endure. We need His encouragement as we're pulled to reject His ways by our sin nature in the flesh. But God will give us help. He will give us encouragement. In fact, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "No temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it." God will provide a way out for us when this inner conflict is raging. Daniel has shown us how to choose God's way over and over and over again in the face of intense pressures that many of us will probably never experience. But he was courageous and confident in God's ways, and God blessed that. And God will bless us as we choose to act in line with his ways. And each week we have next steps to help us to act in line with God's ways, because we want to be doers of God's word. We want to trust him. We want to obey him. We want to follow what it is that he tells us to do. So here's some next steps that you might want to take in response to the message today. The first is to play my role in his story. God has placed each of us in our families, in our jobs, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, and on our sports teams for a reason. There's a purpose to where you are located right now. God has a role for you to play in his story in that location this week. Look for ways that you can play that role well. Maybe it's giving an invitation to somebody to join us for Easter here at CIV. But be on the lookout and commit to play your role in his story. Another next step that you might want to take is to commit to building God's kingdom not my own. There's this temptation, right, to be building my kingdom here rather than God's eternal kingdom. But as we saw, kingdoms rise and fall. God's kingdom is eternal. And we want to build his kingdom now and on into eternity. So are there some commitments that you want to make in order to focus on building God's kingdom instead of your own that you can do this week? Write it down, commit to do it. And then a final next step is to choose hope, courage, and faith as you fight to the finish. Are you filled with a confident expectation that God is working in situations that you are facing? That's what this next step is encouraging you to do. I was struggling this week. I was exhausted. I didn't know how everything was going to get done. I was discouraged in some ways. And God encouraged me to ask him for endurance, to ask him for encouragement through his word, the Bible. And God filled me with the confident expectation that he will give me what I need. I just need to keep moving forward and be faithful in my responsibilities. And as I went to God and as he gave me this endurance and encouragement, it was like this weight and this cloud was lifted from over me. So choose to be a person full of hope this week. Not because it looks like you're going to have a good week and there's these favorable circumstances, but because you trust that God will give you exactly what you need as you move forward and fight to the finish. Now, before I pray to close out the message, I just want to invite everybody to join us again next week. We're going to be starting a new message series called Built to Last. And one of the ways that God has designed for his people to be strengthened and encouraged and have endurance in the fight to the finish is by living in community with his people in churches. And we're going to take a look at CIV's 37-year history of CIV here in this message series. We're going to look at our mission and our values and our strategy. And this series is going to be a great reminder of how our mission and values aren't changing. And we can be the church God wants to us even while we're in the middle of searching for a new senior pastor. So I hope you can join us again next week. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you so much that you have shown us, yes, there are these battlefronts. There's these conflicts going on, but you are right there with us. You're going to help us. Nations, they come and they go, but your kingdom endures forever. We can invest now in a kingdom that is never going away. Help us to see life from that perspective and that angle. Help us to invest in your kingdom this week. Show us what that looks like in the locations that you've put us at. In Jesus' name, amen.